On the morning of October 14th, 1851, Silas Crenshaw stood in the doorway of his father's house for the last time and listened to his brothers divide up the world without him. The old man had been dead 3 days. The smell of cedar shavings still clung to the parlor where they'd laid out the coffin, and the October air carried the sharp tang of wood smoke and dying leaves through the open windows of the farmhouse in Carter County, Kentucky. Silas was 31 years old, the youngest of 4 sons, and the only one who had stayed home to care for their father through the long, rattling final months of consumption. He had spooned broth into the old man's mouth, changed his soiled bedclothes, read to him from the almanac on nights when the coughing wouldn't stop. His brothers had visited twice, once at Christmas, once when it was clear the end was near. Now they stood around the kitchen table with a surveyor's map spread between them, and they carved up 200 acres of bottomland and timber like men portioning a pie. "Silas gets the hollow," said Wallace, the eldest, without looking up. He traced a finger along a shaded crescent at the eastern edge of the property, a steep, rocky ravine that plunged between 2 ridges like a wound in the earth. "It's what Father wanted." "The hollow?" Daniel, the second brother, laughed through his nose. "That's nothing but rocks and copperheads. You can't farm it. You can't graze it. You can barely walk through it without breaking an ankle." "Father left a letter," Wallace said, and his voice carried the flat authority of a man who had already decided to feel no guilt. "Silas gets the 40 acres of the hollow, the cave rights, and the spring. The rest divides among us 3. Silas said nothing. He looked at the map. He looked at the place where the hollow was drawn in tight, nervous lines, the cartographer's pen pressing harder, as if the land itself resisted being flattened onto paper. 40 acres of vertical stone, a cave mouth that breathed cold air in summer and warm air in winter, and a spring that ran clear and cold from somewhere deep inside the ridge. "You could sell it to me," Daniel offered, grinning. "I'll give you $60, and you can start fresh out west." "No," Silas said. It was the only word he spoke during the entire proceedings. He packed a mule that afternoon. 2 wool blankets, an axe, a handsaw, a cast-iron skillet, a sack of cornmeal, a pouch of salt, a tinderbox, 3 books, a geology primer, a volume of Emerson's essays, and a battered copy of The Practical Builder, and a leather roll of chisels that had belonged to his grandfather. By evening, he was standing at the mouth of the cave, watching the last light turn the sycamore trees along the creek bed into columns of hammered gold. The cave exhaled. He felt it before he understood it. A slow, steady breath of air pushing outward from the darkness, warmer than the October evening by a good measure. He held his hand in the current and felt the temperature on his skin, constant and gentle, like standing near a sleeping animal. He had noticed this as a boy, playing in the hollow while his brothers hunted squirrels on the ridgetop. The cave breathed warm in autumn, cool in summer. He had asked his father about it once, and the old man had shrugged and said the hills had their own way of doing things. Now, alone with 40 acres of supposedly worthless rock, Silas Crenshaw stepped inside and began to learn exactly what the hills' way was. The first weeks were hard in the way that only solitude and stone can be hard. The cave entrance was wide, nearly 20 feet across, and tapered inward like a funnel, narrowing to a passage about 8 feet high and 6 feet wide that ran straight back into the ridge for what Silas estimated to be 140 feet before opening into a broader chamber. The floor was uneven limestone, slick in places with a thin film of moisture that seeped from the walls. The ceiling dripped. The darkness beyond his lantern was absolute and thick, the kind of darkness that seemed to have texture, like black wool pressing against his eyes. But the temperature, that was the thing. On the morning of October 19th, when frost silvered the grass outside and his breath hung in clouds at the cave mouth, the air 30 feet inside held steady at what he estimated was 60 degrees. By November, when the first hard freeze came and ice crusted the spring's pool, the deep chamber maintained its warmth so reliably that Silas could sit in his shirt sleeves and read by lantern light while the world outside turned hostile and white. He understood the principle, at least in rough terms, from his geology primer. The earth itself was warm. Below a certain depth, rock maintained a nearly constant temperature year-round, insulated from the swings of season and weather by the sheer mass of stone above and around it. The cave was not heated by any fire. It was held by the earth, the way a cellar holds the coolness of spring through the heat of July, only in reverse. Thermal mass, the book called it. The stone absorbed warmth slowly and released it slowly, creating a constancy that no wooden house with a fireplace could match. He set to work, making the cave livable. The first project was the wall. Using flat stones from the creek bed and clay dug from the bank, he built a curving wall across the cave entrance, leaving a doorway fitted with a frame of oak planks and a door he hung on hand-forged hinges. The wall was 2 feet thick at its base, and he packed the gaps with moss and clay until it was nearly airtight. He left a square opening near the top, covered with a wooden shutter to allow ventilation and the passage of the cave's breath. The floor he leveled over the course of 3 weeks, chiseling away high points and filling low spots with packed gravel and flat stones until he had a reasonably even surface across a space roughly 20 feet deep and 15 feet wide, his living area. He built a sleeping platform from split logs, raised a foot off the floor to avoid the damp, and laid his blankets over a mattress of dried leaves and cedar boughs that he replaced every 2 weeks. For cooking, he built a small hearth just inside the entrance wall, with a chimney channel he chipped upward through a natural crack in the rock. The draft was imperfect. Some mornings the cave filled with a haze of smoke that made his eyes water. But by adjusting the flue opening and the door shutter, he learned to manage the airflow so that the smoke drew outward more often than not. By December, he had a home. It was crude. It was dark. The walls wept moisture on wet days, and the floor was cold underfoot, even when the air was warm. But it held steady at something near 55 to 60 degrees through the worst winter Carter County had seen in a decade, while his brother's farmhouses shuddered under wind and burned through cord after cord of firewood. Word got around, as it always does in small counties. Silas Crenshaw was living in his cave like a hermit, like a madman, like a bear. People in town speculated about his sanity. Daniel, when asked, would shake his head and say his youngest brother had always been peculiar, good with books but no common sense. The phrase caveman followed Silas through the winter like a stray dog snapping at his heels. He let it follow. Words were just sounds. They couldn't hurt him unless he let them. The spring came early that year, as though the hills were impatient with winter. By the second week of March, the redbud trees along the creek were studded with blossoms the color of a bruise fading to pink, and the cave mouth framed a view of the hollow so beautiful it stopped Silas's breath each morning when he opened his door. He spent the spring exploring deeper. He had been cautious through the winter, keeping to his front chamber, venturing into the passage beyond only with his lantern held high and a rope tied to his waist. But now, with longer days and a growing confidence in the cave's stability, he began to push farther. The main passage continued beyond the first chamber, narrowing and widening unpredictably, sometimes opening into side rooms barely large enough to crouch in, sometimes vaulting upward into cathedral spaces where his lantern light couldn't reach the ceiling, and his voice came back to him in long, rolling echoes. It was in one of these deeper chambers, perhaps 250 feet from the entrance, that he found the water. Not the spring. He already knew about the spring, which emerged at the base of the ridge outside. This was something else. A still pool, roughly 10 feet across, sitting in a shallow depression in the chamber floor. The water was glass clear and cold enough to numb his fingers when he dipped them in. It appeared to have no current, no inlet or outlet that he could see, though it must have been fed from somewhere, because it never dried up and never overflowed. He noticed the shimmer on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. A trick of his lantern, he thought at first, the light catching the surface of the water and bending. But when he knelt closer and held the lantern to one side, the shimmer didn't move with the light. It came from below, from the bottom of the pool, perhaps 2 feet down. Something caught the light and threw it back in broken, glittering fragments. Silas set the lantern on a flat rock. He rolled up his sleeve. He reached into the water, which was so cold it made his forearm ache, and his fingers closed around something hard and angular on the pool's floor. He pulled it up and held it to the light. It was a crystal, a cluster of crystals to be precise, 6 or 7 hexagonal prisms jutting from a common base, each one clear as glass and roughly the length of his index finger. They were sharp-edged and perfectly formed, catching his lantern light and splitting it into faint rainbows that danced across the wet walls of the chamber. Quartz. He knew enough from his geology primer to recognize it. But these were not the cloudy, chunky quartz fragments he'd seen in creek beds and road cuts all his life. These were gem-quality points, transparent, flawless, and beautiful in a way that made him hold his breath. He spent the rest of that day and the whole of the next exploring the pool and the chamber around it. The crystals were not just at the bottom of the pool. They lined the walls of the depression, clustered along cracks in the limestone where mineral-rich water had seeped for centuries, millennia, perhaps, depositing layer after layer of silica in the slow, patient geometry of crystal growth. Some clusters were the size of his fist. Others were as large as a man's head, bristling with points that caught even the faintest light and turned it into something alive. He did not know what they were worth. He did not, in that moment, particularly care. What moved him was the fact that the earth had been doing this, growing these impossible, precise structures, in total darkness, in silence, with no audience and no purpose except the blind obedience of mineral to law. For thousands of years, while nations rose and fell and men fought and died over dirt and dollars, the cave had been quietly making diamonds out of water and time. Not diamonds, quartz. But in the lantern light, kneeling in cold water up to his elbow, Silas Crenshaw could be forgiven for not knowing the difference and for not caring. He cared soon enough. In May, he wrapped a dozen of the best specimens in cloth, packed them in his saddlebag, and rode 12 miles to the town of Grayson. He did not go to his brother's. He went to the general store, where a man named Alderman bought and sold curiosities, arrowheads, fossils, unusual stones, alongside dry goods and ammunition. Alderman turned the crystals over in his thick fingers, held them to the window light, and set them down on the counter with a care that told Silas everything he needed to know before the man opened his mouth. "Where did you get these?" "My land. These are exceptional specimens. Museum quality, some of them." Alderman looked at Silas with new eyes, the reassessing gaze of a man who has just realized the person in front of him is not what he assumed. "I can give you $2 apiece for the small ones. The large cluster, I'd need to write to a man I know in Cincinnati, a collector. He pays well for pieces like this. $2 apiece." Silas had been living on cornmeal and wild game for 7 months. $2 would buy flour, coffee, sugar, nails, and lamp oil for a month or more. The large cluster might fetch $10 or $15. He left 6 specimens with Alderman and rode home with supplies, a lightness in his chest, and the beginning of a plan. Over the summer, he worked the cave with the deliberate patience of a man who understood that the crystals had taken millennia to form and deserved something better than a pickaxe. He developed a method. He would identify a cluster, then carefully chisel away the surrounding limestone, working inward from the edges, the way a sculptor frees a figure from a block of marble. He soaked stubborn sections with water to soften the calcium deposits. He used his grandfather's fine chisels for the delicate work around the points, tapping so gently that each stroke barely whispered against the stone. A single good cluster could take 2 full days to extract without damage. He cataloged everything. In a ledger he bought from Alderman, he recorded each specimen's location in the cave, its dimensions, the number and clarity of its points, and the price it eventually fetched. By August, the collector in Cincinnati, a mineralogist named Dr. Werner Hoffman, had purchased 7 pieces for a combined $43 and written Silas a letter asking for more. The letter was 4 pages long. It explained, in precise and enthusiastic German-inflected English, that Silas's specimens were among the finest examples of hydrothermal quartz Dr. Hoffman had ever seen east of the Arkansas deposits. The clarity, he wrote, suggested formation in unusually pure silica-rich water at moderate temperatures over an extended period, possibly 50,000 years or more. He asked whether the cave contained other minerals. He asked about the geological formation. He asked if he might visit. Silas wrote back and said yes. Dr. Hoffman arrived in September, a compact, energetic man of 50 with wire spectacles and a leather case full of instruments Silas had never seen. He spent 3 days in the cave, during which he spoke more words than Silas had heard in the previous year. He identified not only quartz, but calcite formations, a vein of celestine, a pale blue crystal of strontium sulfate that he said was quite rare in Kentucky, and what he believed might be a small deposit of fluorite, which glowed an eerie violet under certain conditions. "You are sitting on a mineralogical cabinet," Dr. Hoffman told Silas on the second evening, as they ate beans and cornbread by the fire at the cave's entrance. "This is not a cave. This is a library, written in stone." "I've been reading it," Silas said. Dr. Hoffman laughed, a sharp, delighted bark, and clapped Silas on the shoulder. "Yes, that is exactly right. You have been reading it, and you read well for a man with no training." Before he left, Dr. Hoffman made Silas a proposition. He would act as an agent, connecting Silas with collectors, universities, and museums across the eastern states. He would take a commission of 15%. In return, he would teach Silas proper identification and extraction techniques, provide him with reference materials, and ensure that the best specimens went to institutions where they would be studied and preserved rather than sitting on a rich man's mantle. Silas agreed. They shook hands at the cave mouth while the September light turned the hollow into a corridor of red and gold, and something in Silas's life shifted from survival to purpose. The following year brought changes that arrived quietly, the way the seasons did, not with announcement, but with accumulation. Silas expanded his living quarters, chiseling out a second chamber for storage and work, and building proper shelving from walnut planks he milled himself from trees in the hollow. He laid a flagstone floor over the packed gravel and installed a proper iron stove, which Dr. Hoffman helped him source from a foundry in Ashland. The stove transformed the cave from a survivable shelter into something approaching comfort. He could cook without smoke, heat water for washing, and dry his clothes on a rack above the stovepipe without the constant dampness that had plagued his first winter. He built a porch. It seemed absurd, a porch on a cave, and he knew the townspeople would find more ammunition for their jokes in it. But he wanted a place to sit in the evening and watch the hollow fill up with blue shadow while the ridgetops still held the last copper light of sunset. So he framed it out from the cave wall with locust posts, locust being nearly impervious to rot, and roofed it with split oak shingles. He built a bench. He sat on it in the evenings with a cup of coffee and his geology books and felt, for the first time in his life, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. It was on this porch, in June of 1853, that he met Clara. Clara Reinhardt was Dr. Hoffman's niece, or more precisely, his wife's sister's daughter, recently arrived from Bavaria and employed as a schoolteacher in the town of Olive Hill, 15 miles east. She had come with her uncle on his second visit to catalog new specimens, and she stood at the cave mouth with her dark hair pinned sensibly beneath a straw hat, and her eyes moving across the crystal specimens laid out on the workbench with the focused attention of someone who was looking not just at the surfaces but into the structures beneath. "My uncle says you taught yourself mineralogy," she said, picking up a celestine cluster and tilting it toward the light. "The cave taught me," Silas said. "I just pay attention." She smiled at that, a quick, private smile, as though he had said something that confirmed a suspicion she'd been holding. She had a directness about her that Silas found immediately disorienting and then, over the course of the afternoon, increasingly essential. She asked questions that his brothers would never have thought to ask and that the townspeople would have considered pointless. How did the temperature vary by depth? Had he mapped the water table? Did the crystal formations correlate with specific strata in the limestone? She also asked questions his brothers would have understood perfectly. Was he lonely? Did he miss his family? What did he do on Sundays? He answered all of them honestly, which was, for Silas, a form of intimacy more revealing than any confession. They were married the following spring, in a small ceremony at the Lutheran church in Olive Hill. Clara moved into the cave, a fact that scandalized the county and delighted Dr. Hoffman, who said his niece had always had more sense than society knew what to do with. Clara transformed the space, not with decoration or fuss, but with systems. She organized the specimen catalogs, improved the storage conditions by designing cloth-lined wooden cases that prevented chipping during transport, and began corresponding directly with 3 museums and a dozen private collectors. She kept the accounts with a precision that made Silas's ledger look like a child's scrawl. Within a year, their income from crystal sales had doubled, not because they sold more, but because Clara ensured they sold better, matching the finest specimens to the buyers who would pay the most and bundling lesser pieces into educational collections for schools and universities. She also planted a garden on the narrow strip of flat ground beside the creek, and in the evenings, after the work was done, she and Silas would sit on the porch and she would read aloud from Humboldt's Cosmos while the hollow darkened around them and the cave breathed its warm, steady breath at their backs. The years accumulated like sediment, slow and rich, and their first child, a son named August after Clara's father, was born in 1855, a daughter, Emmeline, followed in 1857, and a second son, Thomas, in 1860. The children grew up in the cave, though by then it was barely recognizable as one. Silas had expanded the living space to include 3 separate chambers, connected by arched passages he had carved himself over the course of years. The main room had a flagstone floor, plastered walls where the stone was too rough, bookshelves built into natural alcoves, and windows, actual windows, cut through the thinner sections of rock at the front of the ridge and fitted with glass panes that let in pale, filtered daylight. The children played in the hollow. They learned to identify minerals before they could read. August could distinguish quartz from calcite by the age of 6. Quartz scratched glass. Calcite fizzed in vinegar. Emmeline developed a gift for drawing specimens with scientific accuracy, her careful illustrations eventually appearing in 2 of Dr. Hoffman's published papers. Thomas, the youngest, was drawn to the engineering of the cave itself, the way air moved, water flowed, temperature balanced, and would later study at the University of Kentucky, becoming one of the state's first trained geologists. Meanwhile, the world beyond the hollow moved in its own patterns. Daniel Crenshaw's farm failed in 1858, undone by a combination of depleted soil and bad loans. He sold his share of the family land to Wallace and moved to Indiana, where he died of pneumonia in 1867. Wallace held on longer, but the Civil War devastated Carter County's economy, and by 1870 he was farming a fraction of what the family had once owned, his fields yielding less each year from soil that had been planted in tobacco for 3 generations, without rest. Silas, in his cave, was largely untouched by the war. The hollow was too remote, too steep, too obviously worthless to attract foragers or recruiters. He continued his work, continued his correspondence, and continued to discover. In 1863, following the main water channel deeper than he had ever gone, he found a second crystal chamber, larger than the first, its ceiling covered in calcite formations that hung like frozen curtains, translucent and faintly amber, beautiful beyond any practical use. He did not sell these. He simply cataloged them, drew them, and brought his children to see them by lantern light. Some things, he told August, were not inventory. They were inheritance. By 1875, Silas Crenshaw was a modestly wealthy man, not rich by the standards of industrialists or plantation owners, but comfortable in a way that had nothing to do with comfort's usual measurements. He had no debt. He had a home that cost nothing to heat. He had a wife who was his intellectual equal and his partner in everything. He had 3 children who were educated, curious, and kind. He had the respect of scientists and collectors across the country and a growing reputation as the foremost amateur mineralogist in eastern Kentucky. He also had, though he never spoke of it, the quiet satisfaction of having outlasted every prediction and every insult. He had not sought revenge against his brothers. He had not gloated when Daniel's farm failed or when Wallace came to him, hat in hand, asking to borrow money in the winter of 1871. Silas had lent him the money, $100, a significant sum, and never asked for it back. He did not need to. The loan itself said everything that needed saying. Silas Crenshaw died on March 3rd, 1891, at the age of 71. He died in the main chamber of his cave home, in the bed he had built with his own hands 39 years earlier, though the frame had been rebuilt twice, and the mattress was now proper horsehair instead of cedar boughs. Clara was beside him. August and Thomas stood at the foot of the bed. Emmeline, who had married a professor of natural history at Transylvania University and moved to Lexington, arrived the following morning, too late. His last coherent words, according to August's journal, were spoken to Thomas, who had asked his father if there was anything else in the cave they hadn't found. "There's always more," Silas said. "Don't stop looking." They buried him on the ridge above the hollow in a plot he had chosen himself, a flat shelf of limestone where the morning sun arrived first and lingered longest. Clara placed a piece of clear quartz on the grave, a single perfect point from the first cluster he had ever pulled from the water. She lived another 12 years, maintaining the cave home and the specimen business with the help of August, who had taken over most of the extraction work. She died in 1903 and was buried beside Silas on the ridge. The cave passed to Thomas, who by then held a position at the Kentucky Geological Survey. He spent the next 2 decades studying and preserving the site, eventually donating the mineral rights to the University of Kentucky in 1921, along with his father's complete catalogs, his mother's business correspondence, and Emmeline's scientific illustrations. The cave was designated a site of geological interest by the state in 1934. Today, if you drive the back roads of Carter County on an October afternoon, when the ridges are burning with color and the air carries that particular smell of dying leaves and cold water, you can still find the hollow. The cave mouth is gated now, protected from vandals and careless visitors, but the porch posts, locust just as Silas chose them, still stand, darkened to the color of iron by a century and a half of weather. The cave still breathes, warm air in autumn, cool in summer, steady and patient as the turning of the earth. Geologists have since confirmed what Silas discovered through observation and instinct. The cave sits at the intersection of 2 limestone formations, one permeable, one dense, creating a natural channel for mineral-rich groundwater that has been depositing crystals in its chambers for approximately 70,000 years. The temperature regulation he marveled at is a function of the ridge's thermal mass, 300 feet of solid rock acting as an insulator, maintaining a near-constant 57 degrees regardless of the season above. The crystals he pulled from that still pool in the spring of 1852 are now distributed across 6 museums, 14 university collections, and an unknown number of private cabinets. The Celestine specimens that Dr. Hoffman identified remain among the finest ever recovered in the eastern United States. Thomas Crenshaw's Geological Survey of the Cave, published in 1908, was cited in academic papers for the next 40 years. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Silas Crenshaw's story is not the crystals, or the cave, or the fortune he built from 40 acres of rock that his brothers considered worthless. It is the fact that he never stopped looking. In every account, every letter, every entry in his meticulous ledgers, there is the same restless, quiet attention, the same willingness to kneel in cold water, hold a lantern to the darkness, and wait for the stone to show him what it had been making in silence for 70,000 years. The earth is patient. It does not rush its work. It builds its most beautiful things in darkness, without audience, without applause, one molecule at a time, and it does not care whether anyone ever finds them. But sometimes someone does. Sometimes a man with nothing but a lantern and a geology primer and the stubborn refusal to stop looking kneels beside a still pool in a cave that everyone said was worthless, and he reaches in and he pulls out light.